Hey guys, tonight we slide back into a time when monks weren't always meditating, and nuns weren't exactly living in quiet reflection. The air is thick with candle smoke and unspoken sins. You're wandering the halls of a 13th century abbey, and something doesn't feel holy. Somewhere between Vespers and Confession, strange whispers echo. There's a hint of perfume where there shouldn't be. A monk's robe hanging just a little too neatly. Welcome to the cloister, where celibacy was more of a suggestion, and some took liberties with their vows that would make even modern tabloids blush. You're probably not going to survive this history lesson with your view of medieval piety intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tiptoe past an arched doorway, candle in hand, careful not to make a sound. Stone walls soak up noise like a vault. In this Benedictine monastery, silence is sacred, except when it isn't. Because behind some of these heavy wooden doors, history tells us things weren't as quiet as they seemed. See, the medieval church preached chastity, sure, but human biology rarely gets the memo. Monks and nuns were human first, saintly second. And once the doors closed, temptation didn't knock, it barged in. Let's start with the monks. Officially, they swore off sex for life. But unofficially, many monasteries functioned like spiritual boarding schools for upper-class boys who weren't exactly ready to give up wine, women, or the occasional scandal. Letters survive from bishops scolding abbots for lascivious conduct, which is medieval Latin for monks behaving badly. Some monasteries even got reputations. Picture frat houses with incense and Latin mass. Take the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. Around the 10th century, it was rumoured that some monks hosted secret feasts, wine flowing, music playing, and yes, the occasional guest smuggled in under a cloak. Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerated smear campaigns or honest reports, but multiple sources describe monks sneaking out to visit local villages, and not for prayer walks. Over in France, one bishop in the 12th century launched a full-blown investigation into a convent where, allegedly, the nuns were entertaining visiting clergy. The scandal became so widespread that entire convents were shut down, only to be reopened later with new rules, like never allowing male confessors under 40. Apparently, hot young priests were a risk factor. Now, about those nuns. Popular culture paints them as either serene or sinister, but medieval records show something far more chaotic. Some orders, like the Poor Clares, were strict to the point of obsession. Others, a bit more liberal behind the scenes. You find love notes exchanged under pillowcases, secret windows cut into cloister walls, even nuns sneaking into neighbouring monasteries for spiritual counsel. Sevens. There's a 14th century court case from the Low Countries where a nun was caught climbing a garden wall to meet her monk lover. Her excuse? She was checking the condition of the abbey roof. Bold. Not accurate, but bold. Even more bizarre are the punishments. Monks caught in improper relations could be forced into public penance, barefoot, robed in ashes, confessing sins in front of the whole abbey. Others got shipped off to more remote monasteries, medieval speak for you're grounded forever. And some? They just got quietly reassigned, their misconduct buried in silence. The church kept things hush-hush when it could. After all, these weren't random villagers, they were supposed to be moral examples. But human desire is slippery. Celibacy was less a fortress and more a screen door in a hurricane. Let's not forget the loci amini, those peaceful garden spots around monasteries, filled with flowers, fruit trees, and curious nooks. They weren't just for prayer. Love poems carved into monastery walls hint at stolen kisses and secret meetings under fig trees. And no, that's not a metaphor. Fig trees were oddly popular. One Italian abbess in the 15th century reportedly kept a detailed journal of her visions, which included nightly encounters with angelic men. When church officials investigated, they discovered she was sneaking out every third night. Her defence? Divine ecstasy. The church didn't buy it, but she was transferred rather than punished. Apparently, claiming a heavenly boyfriend came with perks. But perhaps the strangest cases are those where sex and spirituality blurred. Some mystics described their union with Christ in disturbingly sensual terms. One nun wrote of melting into the flesh of the Lord in such detail that later scholars wondered, was this metaphorical? Or just very repressed erotica? Historians still argue whether such writings reflect deep faith, delusion, or cleverly cloaked memoirs. And yes, it gets darker. There are cases, rare but real, of abuse within monasteries, often covered up by church hierarchy. Not every story has a cheeky punchline, but it's part of the record. The same halls that echoed with chants sometimes hid cries. So here you are, pacing through a sacred place where silence reigns, and yet the walls remember everything. They've soaked up centuries of whispered confessions, secret touches, and stolen glances. Tonight, they echo back the truth, that even among the cloistered, the human heart strays. You move past the chapel, past the empty refectory. Somewhere, a door creaks. Is it wind? Or something older, moving just out of view? No matter, we're just getting started. You step out of the abbey's shadow and into the sunlight of a medieval courtyard. It's warm, and there's music drifting from a nearby window. Lute, maybe. And somewhere up in a high stone tower, a noble lady sighs dramatically into the air. Welcome to the age of courtly love, where sex isn't always sex, and love might just be a poetic competition in suffering. At first glance, this world seems oddly romantic. You're a knight, or maybe a low-born scribe, obsessed with the unattainable noblewoman upstairs. You write her verses. You do brave things in her name. You probably carve her initials into a tree or your shield or someone else's horse. In this love language, yearning is the point. You don't touch. You barely speak. You ache gloriously. This idea was shaped by troubadours in 12th century southern France and carried through courts in England, Germany, and beyond. It was love as an art form, decorative, tormented, and deeply impractical. Kind of like a medieval slow-burn fanfic. Historians still argue whether this culture emerged as a genuine code of behaviour or as a literary fantasy passed off as reality. But you soon realise there's a strange duality at play. The same society that promoted spiritual purity also obsessed over unfulfilled sexual longing. The lady in the tower becomes both muse and moral test. She's supposed to be virtuous, cold, and untouchable. And yet, in half the stories, she's also deeply into you. Take Andreas Capellanus' The Art of Courtly Love, a 12th century manual on noble romance. It reads like someone tried to turn emotional masochism into a social contract. One gem suggests a woman can't love a man who's too available. Another claims love can't exist within marriage, because where's the tension in that? So you fall in love, but only if it's inconvenient, humiliating, and absolutely doomed. And here's where things get weird. This system encouraged a whole subculture of love, games, coded language, secret tokens, even elaborate rituals to declare devotion. You might be asked to wear your lady's sleeve on your helmet in a tournament. Sounds sweet, until you realise she's also sending similar tokens to 3 other knights, and one of them is her husband's brother. Meanwhile, you're writing her poetry in a mixture of French and Latin, comparing her eyes to sapphires and her voice to angel songs, which sounds lovely, until she tells you to suffer more attractively. Yes, that was a thing. In some courts, especially Eleanor of Aquitaine's famous Court of Love, women judged cases of romantic complaints like courtroom dramas. A man might say, "My lady smiled at me but now ignores me." The presiding noblewoman might rule, "You failed to ache properly." Try bleeding from the heart. No pressure. But here's the twist. This wasn't always a game of abstinence. While the songs and poems stayed chaste, real life didn't always follow the rules. Behind the poetic front, affairs were common, especially among the upper classes. Nobles had arranged marriages by age 12 or 14, often to people they barely knew. So emotional affairs, both platonic and physical, became outlets. Some noblewomen kept favourites, handsome knights or poets who were technically just companions. Sometimes they stayed that way. Sometimes they didn't. The church was not amused. But aristocrats had a way of doing whatever they pleased, especially when cloaked in metaphor. And this behaviour trickled downward. Even middle-class women in cities began engaging in romantic games, trading notes with young scholars or singing saucy versions of courtly songs. There's a German manuscript from the 13th century that includes a courtly love letter, written entirely in vegetable metaphors. Yes, you read that right. Apparently, cucumbers meant desire and beets symbolised rejection. Historians still argue over whether that was a regional dialect or just some guy being cheeky. Another fringe tidbit. In some areas of France and Italy, couples would practice chaste bedding, spending the night together, fully clothed, talking, holding hands, maybe kissing, but allegedly not consummating. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a 3-hour-long, PG-rated cuddle session. Honestly, adorable, or unbearable, depending on your patience level. And let's not forget the iconography. Artists of the time painted scenes of courtly couples exchanging glances beneath trees, or knights kneeling before their mistresses like saints. But the margins of those same manuscripts? Total chaos. Naked figures chasing each other, animals playing instruments, snails fighting knights, sometimes with phallic mushrooms nearby. It's like medieval illustrators had two modes. Sacred romance, and what if a goose had a fetish? Even the garments played a role. Long sleeves, tightly laced bodices, and heavy cloaks created endless opportunities for accidental touches. Some noble women wore perfume behind their ears and under their arms, not for hygiene, but to make proximity during dances more tantalising. You weren't supposed to kiss, but you could press your cheek near enough to inhale her scent and call it poetry. Of course, not everyone found this charming. Some moralists ranted that courtly love was just a gateway drug to adultery. One monk claimed it made men soft and weak in the knees, which, to be fair, might have been the point. So here you are, caught in a system where love is glorified but sex is taboo, until it isn't. You're writing songs for a lady you can't touch, while wondering if her servant is sneaking love notes back and forth to 5 other men. You compete in tournaments not just for glory, but to impress someone who'll never publicly acknowledge you, unless, of course, she does, and then everything spirals. Your fingers are ink-stained. Your heart is in ruins. Your poetry is, honestly, not bad. But deep down, you're hoping for more than just a polite nod at the feast table. And once the feast ends, and the music fades, and the castle halls grow dark, well, let's just say more than one knight lost his honour under the guise of sacred longing. The castle gates close behind you, but you've still got that lovesick look on your face. You think maybe a walk will help, something to clear your head and, well, cool you down. But then you spot it, hanging behind glass in a small museum room, polished and smug. A chastity belt. Thick iron, medieval looking, complete with a lock and very little airflow. And suddenly you're wondering, was that really a thing? Let's set the mood. It's the 14th century. You're a nobleman about to ride off to war or a long pilgrimage. Your wife, beautiful and very much stuck at home, is left behind in a world where temptation is everywhere and faithfulness is optimistic. So, naturally, you decide to strap a locked metal undergarment around her waist and take the key with you. That's the classic image, right? Except, brace yourself, that image might be total nonsense. Historians still argue whether medieval chastity belts were real or Renaissance-era propaganda. The earliest actual belts that survive today? Most are from the 16th century or later. and many are clearly fakes made for curiosity cabinets, or 19th century museum hoaxes to shock prudish Victorians. But you're here for the idea, and that idea. Oh, it had legs. The concept of chastity belts appears in 14th century satirical poems and medical texts. There's even an Italian drawing from around 1405 that shows a metal contraption locked around a woman's hips, with the note, "Wear this well, my lady." Was it a joke? A warning? A commentary on trust, or lack thereof? Hard to say. But what's clear is this. The idea of controlling female sexuality by physical means wasn't exactly fringe. Even if full metal undies were rare or non-existent, symbolic restraints were real. Some husbands left their wives with locked rooms, literal bodyguards, or even intrusive tests of honour. In certain regions, it was common for women to swear elaborate oaths of fidelity before church altars, sometimes while touching relics. Others were threatened with spiritual punishment. If you stray, may St. Barbara close your womb? Yeah, no pressure. And then there's the other side of the myth, the belts for men. That's right. Some stories describe contraptions used to prevent male self-pleasure. One 15th century German device allegedly involved a spiked ring with a bell attached. Move the wrong way, and, well, let's just say the neighbours would know. Whether or not these devices were actually worn, debate continues, but they sure got talked about. What's undeniable is the fear that fueled the chastity belt's legend. In a society where lineage, inheritance, and family honour meant everything, controlling a woman's sexuality was serious business. And if that control involved mythologized devices that symbolized total ownership, so be it. Of course, the irony is delicious. While men obsessed over guarding their wives' virtue, they weren't exactly wearing metaphorical belts themselves. Male infidelity was often shrugged off. There are documented cases of nobles fathering half a dozen children out of wedlock while demanding their wives remain spotless paragons. The double standard didn't even pretend to hide. Back to the belt. If anyone did wear something like it, it probably wasn't for years at a time. Think hygiene. Think infection. Think rust. And no blacksmith in his right mind would hand-forge one of these and expect a good Yelp review. One surviving belt in a museum in Florence actually has air holes in artistic shapes, functional and fashionable, or a prank by a horny artisan. One French account from the 15th century tells of a young bride found unconscious after a day in a cruel iron girdle. The villagers were horrified. The belt? Probably more punishment tool than everyday garment. Some suggest it was used more like a short-term shaming device, worn for a week as penance after suspected infidelity. Sort of like a medieval version of walking around with a sign that says, "I broke trust." Sevens. There's even speculation that a few of these devices were actually used during sex, painfully, which would make them less about chastity and more about domination. In this theory, the belts become not safeguards but tools of control, humiliation, or bizarre fetish. That's right. Even in the medieval imagination, things got kinky. Fringe detail? Some belts included locks designed not just to close but to pinch. You heard that correctly. Whether real or imagined, those locks were symbols of both possession and cruelty. They told a story. You're mine, and I don't trust you. Sevens. Now, let's not give the past too much credit. Some of the loudest chastity belt propaganda came after the Middle Ages. In the 18th and 19th centuries, historians looking to mock the medieval era as barbaric pointed to the belt as proof of how backwards everything used to be. Museums bought them up, not to preserve history, but to feed a narrative. Look how far we've come. Still, those belts linger in our cultural memory. You see them in cartoons, comedy sketches, Halloween costumes. But the real story is more nuanced and darker. It's less about medieval mechanics and more about fear, control, and obsession with purity. So now you're standing there, staring at that iron contraption. It's small, cold, and weirdly intricate. You imagine trying to walk in it, sit in it, live in it. You wince. Then you remember, in some ways, the belt was never real, but the fear that built it, that definitely was. You head back into the daylight, rubbing your temples. Love hurts. But medieval trust issues, those hurt way worse. You wander deeper into the market streets now, eyes darting past spices, ribbons, and goat cheese, when something odd catches your gaze. A small wooden stall lined with neatly trimmed hairpieces, except these aren't for the scalp. Welcome to the strange and fuzzy world of merkins. The pubic wigs of the medieval and early modern era. Yep, you heard right. People were slapping artificial hair down there centuries before razors or waxing strips were even a thing. And the reasons? Not what you'd expect. Let's start with the practical. You're a sex worker in 15th century London. Business is booming. Sort of. The Black Death thinned the competition, and your services are still in high demand, but now there's a problem. Lice. Not head lice. The other kind. And shaving. That becomes an early solution. Only shaving wasn't subtle, and clients started associating hairlessness with disease, specifically syphilis, or the French disease as it was bitterly nicknamed across Europe. Fun fact, the French called it the Neapolitan disease. Nobody wanted ownership. So what do? You slap on a wig, a merkin, to hide the bald truth and keep business. Growing. Historians still argue whether merkins were commonly worn in the actual Middle Ages or whether their real heyday began in the early modern period, but the roots of the practice go back far. In some brothels, they were considered standard issue, like an apron in a bakery, not just for covering up disease or shaving, but sometimes to impersonate youth or enhance desirability. Creepy? Yes. Common? Possibly. And the materials? Well, human hair was the gold standard, but horsehair and wool were also used. Some merkins were dyed in dramatic colours, reds, golds, even blue for the fashionably bold. A German brothel ledger from the 16th century references dyed underwigs as part of a working woman's tax-deductible tools of trade, which raises the very modern question. Can you expense a merkin? But it wasn't just for the sex trade. Aristocratic women had their reasons too. You're a noble lady with a horrible rash, because personal hygiene in the 1300s was a gamble. You shave to treat the problem, but modesty and status demand the illusion of perfection. A finely made pubic wig becomes not just a patch, it's a performance. A statement. You're whole. You're proper. You're not diseased. Probably. There are fringe tales, too. One old Venetian diary suggests that courtesans used jewelled merkins for seduction. Yes, jewelled. Tiny pearls, delicate embroidery, even miniature bells. Subtle? Absolutely not. But in an era where erotic art still clung to symbolism, these accessories said what words couldn't. Desire me. They jingled. Just not too closely. Sevens. And there's more. Some ecclesiastical records mention priests advising women to wear false hair to guard the eyes of men when using public baths. Now, whether this was about modesty or temptation suppression is unclear. But the church, as always, had opinions. You couldn't win either way. Too much hair? Sinful? Too little? Suspicious? Even artists got in on the act. Medieval and early Renaissance painters sometimes added triangular tufts to their nudes, subtle hints at sexuality, often stylized like little brushstrokes. Yet scholars debate, are those natural, or the era's artistic equivalent of Photoshop add-ons? There's one particularly strange mention in a 14th century Italian poem where a man, in an erotic dream, plucks the fur from his lady's fountain and finds it grows back silkier. Whether that's fantasy, metaphor, or just some medieval poet showing off, no one agrees. But the imagery? Unmistakable. And while most of this stayed behind closed doors, Merkins did slip into performance art. Early street theatre, especially the bawdy stuff frowned upon by the church, sometimes used costume wigs down below, part shock, part humour, part social commentary. In one infamous Dutch skit, a nun loses her habit in a gust of wind, revealing not just flesh but a bright red merkin, eliciting gasps and scandalised laughter. The crowd loved it. The church, not so much. One curious tidbit. Some travelling doctors sold virginity restoration kits that included a pale blonde merkin, sold as a way to recreate a youthful illusion for nervous brides. Whether anyone bought this with a straight face is uncertain, but the sales pitch alone deserves an eye roll. And yes, there were whispers of noblemen collecting the merkins of their lovers. Trophies, they called them. Keepsakes. Tied with silk ribbons, stored in little velvet boxes. Imagine being that guy, boasting to your peers while pretending your beard didn't itch from the powdered wig you wore up top. Fast forward, and you realise the merkin's legacy didn't die. Centuries later, it returned, stage and screen, burlesque and film sets, even high-fashion runway shows. But its medieval roots, pure survival and deception, a workaround in a world obsessed with purity but terrified of real bodies. So here you are, staring at this small, fur-tufted triangle on a wooden stand, somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. You wonder, who wore it? Why? Did they laugh as they tied the strings, or sigh with shame? Was it freedom, or just one more mask in a time full of them? As the wind picks up in the market square, you step back, mind swirling with the image of lace and velvet, horsehair and glitter, and you whisper to yourself, half amused, of all the medieval relics I expected, that wasn't one. You find yourself slipping into a dim alcove of an old library, the air thick with the scent of leather bindings, mildew, and secrets. The candlelight flickers across faded pages as you ease open a heavy manuscript, illustrated, of course. And what you find is confusing. One figure is caressing what might be a thigh. Another is either a donkey or an angel. There's definitely a naked man jousting with his own anatomy. Welcome to the delightfully awkward, often unhinged world of medieval sex manuals. Before you get too excited, remember, these weren't manuals the way we think of them today. You're not flipping through a how-to guide with neat diagrams and step-by-step instructions. These books were messy blends of theology, medicine, superstition, poetry, and the occasional doodle that really makes you question the artist's home life. Still, they existed, and for their time, they were shockingly bold. You start with the Secretum Secretorum, the Secret of Secrets, a 12th century Latin text attributed to Aristotle. Falsely, of course, dead philosophers were very popular ghostwriters. While much of it deals with kingship and moral behaviour, tucked between the lectures are passages on aphrodisiacs, the moisture of love, and techniques to awaken the humours of Venus. No diagrams, just vibes. Then there's the Trotula, a set of medical treatises written in 11th or 12th century Salerno, Italy, likely by a female physician. It talks about women's bodies, sexual pleasure, and fertility, including advice like, women should be warmed gently before intercourse, lest their wombs reject the seed, which is oddly considerate, in its own pre-scientific way. And scattered across Europe were other texts. Part medicine, part erotica, part nightmare fuel. A German manuscript advises men to eat roasted hedgehog to improve virility. A French one says snails in wine stir passion in the loins. A 13th century Welsh poem tells of a man who gained stamina by wearing a hare's foot in his underclothes. Historians still argue whether these prescriptions were ever followed, or just jokes that somehow got preserved for 800 years. And now we can't unread them. Then there's the imagery. Oh boy. Medieval marginalia, the art stuffed into the edges of illuminated manuscripts, became a secret playground for frustrated scribes and illustrators. While the central text might be a sombre religious tract, the margins are pure chaos, A man kissing a tree that has legs, a nun embracing a disembodied tongue, and at least one naked knight doing battle with a giant snail, because why not? One 14th century English manuscript features what appears to be a couple in bed, with a dog watching disapprovingly from the corner. Another shows two monks with exaggerated anatomy jousting, their weapons colliding mid-air. It's unclear whether these were satirical, cathartic, or just the result of too many nights without daylight. Even the Roman de la Rose, a popular 13th century French poem turned graphic novel of sorts, walks a fine line between the poetic and the porny. You follow the narrator's dreamlike journey through a metaphorical garden, in pursuit of a single rose. Yes, it's a metaphor for exactly what you think. Along the way, he meets Lady Idleness, Fair Welcome, and a character literally named Sweet Talk. The climax, pun intended, is both literary and explicit enough to be banned centuries later. And that goat? Right, almost forgot. Some texts reference animals in ways that make you back slowly out of the room. Allegories? Maybe. Misunderstood bestiaries? Possibly. Evidence of very confused copyists? Highly likely. But not everything was naughty just for fun. Some manuals tried to strike a balance between morality and sexuality. You were supposed to use sex to produce children, sure, but also to strengthen marital bonds. Lust within wedlock, as one bishop put it, is like fire in a hearth. Controlled. Contained. And if you happen to burn the whole house down, well, that's between you and your confessor. And let's talk about those confessors. In some parts of Europe, priests were instructed to ask very specific questions during confession. Have you lay with your spouse in the light? Did you enjoy it too much? Was the union for pleasure or only for procreation? Suddenly, it wasn't just what you did, it was how you felt while doing it. Lust was sin, even in marriage, if it got too spicy. But no one ever defined too spicy. Convenient, no? So, naturally, people turned to books, whispered about, hidden in trunks, borrowed from apothecaries, and often hand-copied with little additions. A scribe might slip in a new herbal recipe or a racy joke, or a crude little sketch. There's a reason many surviving sex-related manuscripts are one of a kind. And don't assume it was just men reading these. Educated women, especially in merchant or noble households, had access to personal libraries. Some even commissioned custom works, collections of love poetry, erotic allegories, and astrological sex calendars. Yep. People planned their romantic nights based on star charts. Do not attempt coupling while Mars is in retrograde, one chart warns ominously. Some fringe lore? A 15th century text from Prague describes a monk-turned-herbalist who claimed he could determine a woman's favourite position by examining the lines on her palms. Whether he used this skill for matchmaking or other purposes is lost to time. Eventually, many of these manuscripts were seized, banned, or destroyed by reformers who saw them as corrupting filth. But others simply faded, tucked away in private collections or mislabelled in dusty archives. Today, they sit in museum vaults or academic libraries, waiting to shock the next poor intern who opens the wrong folio. You close the manuscript gently, the goat staring up at you from the last page like it knows too much. The candle gutters. You're still not sure what you just read, but one thing's clear. Even in the shadow of the church, under the weight of sin and silence, people found ways to ask, explore, and sometimes laugh about the mysteries of sex. They scribbled awkward drawings. They mixed herbs with hope. They wrote metaphors with just enough plausible deniability to stay out of trouble. And here you are, centuries later, still trying to decode them. You emerge from the library, dazed and blinking, like you've time-travelled back into fresh air after a strange fever dream. But don't get too comfortable, because tonight, you're not off the hook. If you lived in medieval Europe, your bedroom habits didn't just stay behind closed doors. They followed you to the confessional, to the pulpit, and sometimes all the way into public record. Welcome to the long, guilt-soaked shadow of sin, guilt, repeat, where confessing your carnal errors wasn't just spiritual hygiene, it was practically a weekly ritual. You find yourself standing before the dark wood of a confession booth, centuries old and smooth from anxious hands. You step in. It smells like wax and old incense. And if you were a medieval Christian, this is where your secrets come to die, or at least get documented in chilling detail. Confession was required at least once a year, usually before Easter, but many people went more often. Why? Because mortal sin could send you straight to hell. And yes, sex outside of marriage counted. So did sex inside marriage, if it was too enthusiastic. Or if you did it on the wrong day, or in the wrong position, or with the wrong intention. Basically, if you weren't procreating in silence, under a blanket, facing Jerusalem, you might need to confess it. Let's walk through it. You're kneeling. You whisper, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The priest asks questions. Not vague ones, specific. Medieval manuals for confessors were incredibly thorough. Did you touch yourself? Did you think of someone who is not your spouse? Did you do it standing up? Did you use oil, ointments, or other substances? Yes, there were rules. So many rules. And the answers? They were written down. Not your name, usually, but the acts. Scribes kept lists. Chroniclers tallied up sins of the flesh like tax returns. In some towns, patterns emerged, entire parishes with reputations. Like that one village in northern Italy where, according to a 14th century bishop, the women lie with their husbands atop barrels, and not as is proper. Historians still argue whether this was meant literally or as colourful gossip. Let's not pretend the clergy were detached observers, either. Some confessors got way too curious. There are recorded complaints by other priests, no less, about clergy who lingered during confessions, asking suggestive questions. One bishop in 1287 even banned confessions behind curtains entirely, stating that some priests ask more about sensation than salvation. Sevens. Quirky fact. One penance manual classified sins based on how noisy they were. Quiet, impure thoughts. Minor. Audible moaning. Major. Yelling out names that weren't your spouse's. Eternal damnation with a side of Hail Marys. And if you think women got a pass, think again. In fact, female sexuality was policed harder. Women were grilled about their dreams. Their underwear. Whether they looked men in the eye too long. A French confessor's guide even suggested asking if a woman imagined herself being admired while combing her hair. Yes, that was apparently flirting. Worse still, you could confess to things that never happened, just thoughts, dreams, or imagined feelings. Lust in the heart was considered nearly as bad as lust in the body. So even if you hadn't touched anyone in months, if your brain took a 5-second vacation during Mass, you owed the church an explanation. And what was your reward for all this honesty? Penance. Some of it mild. Fasting, prayer, long walks barefoot in the cold. But others, downright performative. You might be ordered to stand in church with a rope around your neck, or wear a shirt covered in ashes. One German town required sinners to walk through the market wearing horns on their heads, while carrying a candle the size of their shame. There's a fringe story from 15th century Hungary about a woman who confessed to touching herself with the handle of a cooking spoon. The priest, allegedly horrified, gave her a penance of sewing Jumzeren cross-shaped patches and stitching them onto poor children's tunics. Whether true or not, that image has stayed preserved in local lore, like a morality fable wrapped in domestic horror. But here's where things get even more complex. Confession was also a release valve. It let people talk, really talk, about sex, desire, fear, and doubt in a society that didn't otherwise allow it. For some, confession was the only therapy they'd ever know. You walked in with a secret that weighed on your soul. You walked out, at least temporarily, lighter, redeemed, maybe even forgiven. And some priests did listen with empathy. There are records of confessors urging troubled couples to be kinder to one another. One Italian friar in 1362 wrote about reconciling a wife to her husband's roughness, and even suggested that she be allowed to sleep apart when she needed rest. That sounds small now, but back then, revolutionary. Some confessional stories hint at solidarity. A priest in Bohemia noted how many women confessed that they dreaded sex but felt powerless to refuse. He began preaching sermons about consent, centuries before anyone called it that. Still, the overwhelming message was guilt. It stuck to people like smoke. Over time, even normal desire became suspicious. You began to believe that to want was to sin. You might even start confessing feelings you didn't fully understand, just to be safe. Which leads us to a chilling consequence: the record keeping. Many of these confessional logs were kept in archives, especially in religious orders. Some monks built entire case studies around anonymous sinners, analysing what led them astray. It became data, fuel for future sermons, and, occasionally, entertainment for more jaded members of the cloth. Imagine your deepest secret read aloud over wine in a scriptorium as a cautionary tale. And all the while, you, the average medieval person, keep cycling through it. Sin, guilt, confession, penance, repeat. It's like a spiritual spin cycle that never quite dries. As you step out of the booth, candlelight dancing on the floor, you wonder who you are without your sins. In a world where even your dreams need forgiveness, what part of you is truly private? Then you glance back at the booth one last time, and something inside you whispers what most people probably felt even back then. Sevens, I'll be back next week. You leave the confessional, swearing you'll live better, straighter, holier. But medieval life doesn't care about your promises, because just when you think you're out of moral peril, you step right into something worse. A trial. And not just any trial, one that may involve a full-on, public, legally sanctioned romp. Welcome to the disturbing and oddly theatrical world of trial by intercourse. It sounds made up, doesn't it? Like something pulled from the fevered imagination of a bored scribe. But in rare corners of medieval Europe, sex wasn't just a sin, it was also evidence, proof, and sometimes punishment. Take the case of marriage impotence trials. You're a newlywed, and things just aren't happening in the bedroom. Maybe your bride looks at you like you're a damp turnip. Maybe you're terrified. Maybe you just can't. In today's world, that might be a therapist's problem. In the 13th century, it was your neighbours. If a couple hadn't consummated their marriage, one of them could sue to have the union annulled. But before that could happen, the court had to know why. So began one of the most uncomfortable legal spectacles imaginable: the Congressus Carnalis, the physical trial. Here's how it worked. In places like France and England, a man accused of impotence might be ordered to prove otherwise. Not just with a doctor, with witnesses. In some cases, he'd be placed in a warm room, surrounded by midwives and church officials, and asked to become visibly capable. The records are vague, but you can imagine the pressure. Jokes aside, historians still argue whether these moments were intended to humiliate or genuinely help. Sevens. And then there were the more intrusive trials. A couple would be placed in a special bed, under court supervision, and expected to perform. Curtains might be drawn, privacy, after all, but midwives or notaries would remain nearby, listening. Some even claimed to check the sheets afterward for results. You think reality TV is invasive? Imagine being judged on the sounds of your honeymoon. Fringe detail? One 14th century French legal record describes a couple who failed this test multiple times, until the wife suggested her husband was bewitched. The solution? An exorcism. He was sprinkled with holy water, given aphrodisiac wine, and ordered to try again. According to the clerk, no issue was made manifest. Annulment granted. Women weren't spared either. If a husband claimed his wife was closed, or otherwise unnatural, midwives would be summoned to examine her. Sometimes they'd insert symbolic objects, wooden phalluses, small crosses, to prove or disprove obstruction. The invasiveness is difficult to overstate. There are records of women weeping as they begged for leniency, while older matrons coldly documented tightness and resistance. Whether it was about law or control is a debate that continues. Then there's the infamous bed trick trials. If a man was accused of loving another woman but claiming impotence with his wife, some courts allowed a ruse. A substitute would lie with him in the dark, while he thought he was with someone else. If he performed, his marriage stood. If not, it was annulled. Whether this counts as justice or medieval gaslighting, well, take your pick. All of this was grounded in the idea that marriage wasn't just spiritual, it was physical. If it couldn't be consummated, it wasn't complete. The church taught that sexual union sealed the bond. So verifying that union became a very public, very awkward civic duty. And yet, these trials weren't purely salacious. Sometimes they became moments of empathy. In one case from 15th century Bologna, a young man confessed, weeping, that fear and inexperience had paralysed him. The judge dismissed the trial and ordered a year of herbal treatments and peaceful nights. The couple later returned, hands held, marriage intact. Miracles happen. Sometimes, but not always. In Paris, a woman named Marguerite accused her husband of deception. He was, she claimed, anatomically incomplete. The court demanded inspection. He refused, so they sentenced him to an instrumental examination. That meant force, gloves, and shame. He fled the city. She was granted a divorce. And in a rare twist, the court ruled in her favour without requiring consummation at all. Even royalty wasn't immune. King Louis VII of France had his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related, but historians suspect bedroom failure played a role. She later married Henry II of England and had 8 children. You do the math. These cases weren't common, but when they happened, they made waves. Songs were written. Gossip flew. And peasants mimicked the trials in bawdy plays, reenacting bed-proofs with exaggerated gestures and comic props. Because even when sex was serious, it was still entertainment. And here's where it gets weirder. Some towns charged admission. You could watch portions of the trial like theatre. No, not the actual act, but the lead-up, the testimonies, the awkward inspections. Picture a courtroom where a man holds up a linen sheet like Exhibit A. Somewhere between justice and farce. One German satire from the late 1400s shows a trial bed surrounded by judges holding long scrolls, while a nervous groom clutches a pillow and a blushing bride hides behind a curtain. Beneath the image, a crude rhyme reads, "If love be weak, the marriage dies. Let trousers prove what tongue denies." 7. Subtlety? Not their strong suit. And through it all, one thing became clear. Your body wasn't just yours. It belonged to your spouse, your community, your priest, your judge. Consent mattered, but so did performance. If you couldn't meet the expectations, you could be cast aside, or paraded, or tested until you broke. So tonight, you lie down not just in your bed, but in the bed of history. And somewhere behind the stone walls of a long-forgotten courtroom, echoes still linger, the creak of floorboards, the murmurs of witnesses, the pressure of proving you were human enough to love, and strong enough to survive scrutiny. You whisper into the darkness, "I'd like my lawyer now." You leave that courtroom, or bedroom, depending on how you're framing it, feeling exposed in ways you didn't sign up for. But no time to linger. You hear bells echoing from a convent tower nearby, and your feet carry you towards something quieter, softer. holy, or so you think. Because tonight, you're about to meet a medieval man who's just slipped into women's robes, not as a prank, not for disguise, but for love, lust, or maybe even a divine misunderstanding. Let's talk about cross-dressing for the Virgin Mary. Sounds absurd at first, doesn't it? But in the Middle Ages, gender roles were strictly drawn, and occasionally utterly ignored in private moments of obsession, faith, or desperation. You wander into a convent's quiet garden and hear someone sobbing near the hedges. He's not a nun. He's not even supposed to be here. But he wears a veil, a habit, and he swears he's in love with the Virgin Mary. Yes, this happened. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe saw a wave of deeply personal religious devotion, some of it beautiful, some of it deeply strange. For a few individuals, especially men overwhelmed by guilt or desire, this devotion tipped into erotic mysticism. And in some extreme cases, that meant impersonating women to experience the closeness they imagined only a bride of Christ could feel. Historians still argue whether these cases were spiritual performances, sexual fantasies, or early expressions of gender identity. The records don't offer clean answers, just fragments. A journal entry here, a confession there, enough to make your skin crawl with curiosity. In one preserved account from 14th century Bohemia, a monk was found living in a nunnery, disguised as a sister. When questioned, he claimed he'd received visions from Mary herself, who told him that dressing as a woman would bring him closer to her divine essence. He claimed he didn't want sex, per se. He wanted union. He wanted to be loved in the same mystical way she was. Weird? Yes. Dangerous? Also, yes. He was excommunicated and imprisoned, though some argue he may have suffered from religious mania, or possibly just too much time in solitude. Then there are the other stories, less spiritual, more scandalous. In a convent outside Ghent, a nun named Beatrix grew popular for her singing voice, which had a rich baritone quality. Too rich. Suspicion grew. When confronted, Beatrix confessed. He was actually the son of a noble family, smitten with a real nun, and had infiltrated the convent to be near her. The two had been secretly meeting for months. When caught, he claimed they had not sinned in the flesh, only in spirit, which, judging by the surviving punishments, didn't save them from a long, cold repentance. And it wasn't always men pretending to be nuns. Sometimes it went the other way. You hear whispers of a Sicilian woman who dressed as a monk for years, even rising to a senior post before anyone discovered the truth. She explained, calmly, that she had no interest in sexual misconduct. She simply believed men had more access to God's work, and she wanted in. She was quietly retired to a rural hermitage. But back to the erotic edge. Medieval mysticism was full of sensual language, especially in descriptions of union with Christ. Female saints wrote of being pierced by the arrows of his love, of feeling his flame enter their womb, of melting into his flesh. Scholars debate. Poetic metaphor, or very private longing cloaked in spiritual language. Some male mystics envied this kind of intimacy. They wanted to be as close to Christ as women were described in these visions. In certain fringe sects, men took this literally, donning veils, fasting, wearing corset-like bands beneath their robes to simulate femininity. Not because they were transgender in a modern sense, but because they believed femininity brought them closer to God. Cue the Church's reaction. Hard nope. Cross-dressing was already associated with heresy in many places. Inquisitors took note. There's a chilling entry from the Inquisition records in Toulouse about a man who dressed as a nun to escape the male gaze and speak with angels unburdened by flesh. The Inquisitor's notes describe this as delirium by desire and recommend purification, i.e., imprisonment and flagellation. But not everyone condemned it. In certain mystic circles, especially among Beguines, lay religious women, gender blurring was seen as symbolic. Some writers suggested that the soul must become female to receive the seed of divine truth. For male devotees, This meant embracing softness, submission, and receptivity, traits traditionally assigned to women. And where there's spiritual vulnerability, desire isn't far behind. In rare poems, you find hints of monks longing not just for God, but for the experience of being desired by God, as women were. One even writes, "If I could bear myself as Mary did, perhaps he would enter me also." That's not subtle. That's theological thirst. Another fringe case comes from England, where a wandering mystic named John claimed to channel the Virgin Mary when in his feminine state. He wore white robes, kissed pilgrims on the cheek, and claimed he could purify them with touch. Some towns welcomed him. Others threw him out. Eventually, he vanished. Whether into sainthood or scandal, no one knows. And through all this, you realise, the line between sex and sanctity in the Middle Ages was often paper-thin. One moment, you're worshipping purity. The next, you're draping yourself in linen and whispering love songs to a vision in blue. Was it sincere? Was it suppressed desire? Was it performance? The answer, frustratingly, might be all of the above. As the convent bells fade into the distance, you glance down a quiet corridor and imagine the rustle of robes, the creak of old wood, and someone alone, draped in candlelight, whispering prayers, or maybe just their own name, spoken sweetly, in a voice not quite their own. The convent walls fade behind you, replaced by dirt roads and open fields, the sun dropping low as you follow the trail of pilgrims heading toward a distant shrine. They walk slowly, some barefoot, some chanting. But not all are here to pray. No, some are here for something else entirely. Because tonight, you're making a stop at a sacred destination where bodies don't just kneel, they mingle. Welcome to the curious intersection of holiness and hedonism. Erotic pilgrimage pit stops. Now, to be clear, not every pilgrim was on the prowl. Many were genuinely devout, travelling for healing, forgiveness, or penance. But where people gather, commerce follows. And where commerce goes, desire never lags far behind. You arrive in a bustling medieval town built around a shrine, maybe Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or the cult of Saint Foy in France. The place is packed. Vendors shout, children weave through the crowd, and there's a line outside the inn that stretches all the way past a man carving wooden saints next to a suspiciously well-stocked ale tent. And you start to notice things. A few of the pilgrims look a bit overdressed. Fancy jewellery. A bit too much perfume for a 30-day barefoot walk. You spot someone winking. Someone else leaning against a chapel wall, humming and swaying just a little too rhythmically. This isn't just spiritual uplift. It's the medieval version of Vegas, minus the electricity but with way more relics. You overhear two travellers talking, not about the shrine, but about the company they kept last night. A local girl, a foreign widow, a merchant with miraculous hands. And you realise that, for many, pilgrimage was also the one socially acceptable reason to leave town. No one questions where you went, or who you met. You're away from your priest, away from your spouse, anonymous among the crowd, and where there's anonymity, things get interesting. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention taverns springing up near pilgrimage sites, sometimes dozens within a mile radius. One bishop in England complained that Canterbury had more brothels than beds for prayer. That's not an exaggeration. In some towns, sex work was so intertwined with pilgrimage culture that local laws were drafted specifically to manage sinful distractions near holy sites. Fringe tidbit? At Mont Saint-Michel, there's a record of a certain innkeeper's daughter who allegedly offered a blessing to male pilgrims in the form of discreet company. Her nickname? La Petite Sainte. Ironic, yes, but not uncommon. Even some shrine wardens allegedly turned a blind eye, so long as donations flowed and scandals didn't make it to the bishop's ears. And those relics? Don't even get started. Some were believed to enhance fertility or sexual vitality. Touching the bones of Saint Vitalis was rumoured to wake the dormant seed. You'd see men lingering by the reliquary, looking nervous. Some left offerings. Others slipped in herbs, locks of hair, or, awkwardly, a pair of underclothes. Seriously, women weren't left out. Some sought saints to bless them with beauty or fertility, or just better luck in love. Saint Agnes, Saint Martha, Saint Apollonia, all had their specific romantic specialties. Some women even left wax figures of their desired lovers at the foot of the altar, hoping for divine intervention. Match. Com, but you're burning incense. And if you couldn't get divine help, you bribed someone. That's right. Romantic intercession. Pilgrims with money could pay friars to say prayers for the success of night relations. One French document even includes a receipt for 3 Hail Marys and 1 candle for the binding of a partner's affection. Effective? Questionable. But it's still less desperate than texting your ex at 2 a. 7s. Then there's the music. Pilgrimage towns often hosted fairs, and those fairs brought minstrels, dancers, and travelling performers, many of whom weren't shy about mixing song with seduction. A lute player might charm a crowd in the square, then charm his way into someone's tent by nightfall. And what about the church's take on all this? Mixed, to say the least. Some clergymen condemned it outright. They warned that such behaviour turned pilgrimage into sin, that no saint would bless lust-soaked feet. One furious abbot wrote, "The road to Rome has become the road to ruin." But others, they accepted it as an inevitable side effect of crowds, travel, and unguarded evenings. Some even used it to preach. If you fornicate in the shadow of a saint, one friar warned, your soul shall feel it 7-fold. Which didn't stop anyone, of course, but made for a good threat. And possibly a very awkward confession the next morning. And historians still argue whether this culture was tolerated or simply unstoppable. Was it a moral failing, or a necessary pressure valve in a repressed society? Were these flings acts of rebellion, or simply human nature expressing itself in the most available space? Either way, people kept coming. In droves. You walk past a row of tents now. Laughter echoes from behind a cloth wall. Someone is singing a hymn nearby, but the melody shifts into something playful. A couple walks past, not quite touching, but close. Closer than strangers should be. You see a wax saint melting in the sun, its face half erased, like a quiet reminder that sacred and profane always lived side by side. And as you make your way toward the shrine itself, you catch sight of a stone carved with worn Latin letters. It translates loosely to, "Come with faith, leave with fire." Maybe they meant spiritual zeal. Maybe they didn't. The shrine fades behind you, the chants replaced by birdsong and the steady clop of a single horse. You follow a narrow trail leading to a manor house on the edge of a small village, modest but sturdy. The gate creaks. A widow leans on the frame of the open door, watching you. She's not in mourning clothes. She's laughing. Tonight, you step into the world of widows who weaponize sex, and no, this isn't the cautionary tale you expected. Because in medieval society, widows held a unique kind of power. They weren't innocent maidens, nor were they sheltered wives. They had lived. They had survived marriage, often childbirth, and sometimes war. And once their husbands were gone, depending on their class, wealth, and region, they could control their own money, their own property, and their own bodies. That made them dangerous. Or, to some, irresistible. Let's rewind. You're in 14th century France. Your husband has just died of a fever, or maybe an arrow, or a bad idea involving fish and holy water. You mourn. You wear black. You say your prayers. But within a year, you're suddenly managing an estate. Tenants report to you. Merchants send letters addressed to you. Suitors begin sniffing around like dogs near an open kitchen. But here's the twist. You don't have to remarry. Unlike daughters or wives, a widow wasn't under a man's guardianship, unless she chose to be. Many did remarry, sure, but others realised the perks of staying single. You could run your affairs, travel, even, if you were clever, enjoy discreet companionship without the church watching your every move. Because you'd already fulfilled your societal duty, you'd married, procreated, and outlived a man. The expectations shifted. Some widows took lovers, others took multiple. One wealthy widow in Venice is rumoured to have had a seasonal arrangement, rotating gentlemen based on summer or winter preference. She justified it by donating handsomely to her local convent. Bribery? Piety? The line was thin. And then there were the power plays. A widow in York, 15th century, seduced her dead husband's younger cousin, then persuaded him to sign over his inheritance to her as a gesture of devotion. 2 years later, she quietly married someone else. The cousin died penniless. Her estate grew. Fringe story. A noblewoman in Castile allegedly kept a velvet-bound journal detailing each of her lovers, rating their performance in Latin with little illustrations in the margins, stars, swords, or a frowning nun, depending. Whether the journal is real or folklore, no one's entirely sure. But it made the rounds in courtly gossip for decades. Some widows also use sex strategically, to protect themselves. You're a widow in a rural manor, isolated, vulnerable. The local reeve starts sniffing around, hinting that maybe your taxes are too high, unless you're willing to negotiate. So you flip the script. You flirt. You imply more than you offer. He gets flustered. You gain time. Maybe lower rent. Maybe just the satisfaction of knowing you made the rules, if only for a moment. And it's not just the upper crust. Working-class widows often took up positions in taverns, inns, or markets. Their freedom, though smaller, still made them outliers. Some became brothel owners, a grey zone where sex, power, and survival intertwined. A German widow named Greta, in 1391, was reported as running a clean house with clean girls. The town council fined her occasionally, but also quietly visited. Church officials, predictably, lost their minds. Widows were frequently singled out in sermons as temptresses. The widow's tongue is sharp, and her bed is warm, warned one priest in Cologne. Guard your sons from her charms. Subtle, but not all clergy condemned them. Some monks, writing privately, admired widows for their independence and even their sexual honesty. One abbot wrote that a widow's confession was cleaner than a virgin's silence, because she knows what sin is and seeks no lies. There's a strange sort of respect buried in that. And here's where it gets especially medieval. The legal double standard. Men could remarry the day after their wife's funeral. No shame. No questions. But a widow who remarried too quickly could be branded as unchaste, even punished. In some places, there were rules. Wait a year, or risk your reputation. In others, people simply whispered behind your back. So many widows learned to play the long game. They hosted feasts of remembrance for their husbands, only to network among eligible bachelors. They gave alms to the church, then used that moral cover to maintain lively social calendars. They maintained the image of grief, while quietly enjoying the privacy that grief, ironically, afforded. And sex? For some, it became a weapon. Not just for manipulation, but for pleasure, for rebellion, for remembering they were alive. Because in a world where your body had never truly been yours, not as a girl, not as a wife, widowhood could be the first moment you owned it outright. There's a record from a Flemish widow's trial in 1420. Accused of seducing her servant, she laughed in court. He is 20 and strong. I am 40 and wise. Who is the victim here? The judge didn't laugh, but the onlookers did. She was fined, not imprisoned. She left court smiling. Was every widow a seductress? Of course not. Many grieved sincerely, lived quietly, took vows of chastity or joined religious orders. But among the crowded pages of medieval history, A handful chose another path, one filled with cunning, laughter, and yes, lust. And as you pass the manor tonight, the lamp still glows in the upper window. The widow's silhouette lingers there, unmoving, watching. The moon is up now, swollen and heavy like a secret you can't quite speak aloud. The trees whisper, the wind pricks your skin, and somewhere nearby, a bottle clinks softly against another. Someone's brewing something strange tonight. You're about to sip from a cup that tastes like honey and rosemary, and regret. Welcome to the murky world of love potions and aphrodisiacs, where desire was bottled, sold, and sometimes deadly. In the medieval world, science, magic, and medicine all blurred together. You didn't exactly pop down to the apothecary for a bottle of mood enhancer Susanine. Instead, you found yourself visiting an herbalist, a midwife, or that one old woman who lived by the marsh and didn't blink enough. And if you were lucky, or unlucky, she'd hand you a potion meant to awaken the body, inflame the heart, or bend someone else's will. Historians still argue whether most of these concoctions were taken seriously or sold as glorified placebos. But the ingredients? All too real. Some were harmless. Cinnamon, honey, mint, ginger, saffron, spices associated with warmth and circulation. Others were more intense. Mandrake root, thought to cry when uprooted, powdered beetle, bat's blood, ground emerald, and occasionally human remains. Yeah, like the ground-up bones of a saint, or so they claimed. You take a sip of one rumoured mix. Wine steeped with basil, clove, and dried figs, with a dash of ground lily root. It's supposed to make you burn with longing. Instead, your tongue goes numb, and you start hearing voices from your left ear only. Congratulations. You just drank an aphrodisiac and a mild hallucinogen. Not uncommon. Love potions were used for all kinds of reasons. To win a partner's attention, rekindle a dying marriage, or, more darkly, to seduce someone who would never say yes otherwise. And because medieval people believed in both spiritual and humoral balance, every potion was a gamble. Too much heat, and you risked boiling the blood. Too much coolness? You were a wet fish, unappealing and sexually inert. There's a 14th century English recipe that advises: take ash from a burned dove, mix with rose oil, and spread upon the thighs. If your lover turns from you still, they are false in soul. Hard to argue with logic like that. But perhaps the most infamous ingredient: Spanish fly, a powder made from crushed blister beetles. Taken in small doses, it supposedly stimulated arousal by irritating the urinary tract. Taken in larger doses, it could kill you. That didn't stop people from trying. Monarchs, knights, even clerics. In one Venetian scandal, a bishop was caught ordering the green powder of longing by name. His excuse: for spiritual energy. Sevens. Right. Fringe fact: in some places, certain foods were banned during Lent not just for religious reasons, but because they were considered too stimulating. Eggs, for example, were thought to awaken lust. So were eels. And peas. That's right. Peas. Nothing says forbidden desire like a bowl of legumes. And then there were the potions designed not for you, but for someone else. One Polish folktale tells of a woman who slipped a loyalty draft into her husband's soup, made of holy water, grave dirt, and boiled nettles. He remained faithful for life, though he also never spoke in complete sentences again. Whether this was a love potion or brain damage is unclear. Some love potions were meant to be hidden, mixed into food, sewn into clothing, or smeared beneath bed sheets. One Catalan guide recommends putting a drop under the tongue, just before declaring your love. Another suggests rubbing it behind the ears, right where your lover might kiss you. Subtle, manipulative, possibly romantic. It wasn't just peasants doing this, either. Royal courts were hotbeds of potion politics. Courtiers hired alchemists to create magnetizing agents for favours. Queens asked for fertility wines that doubled as passion enhancers, and more than a few noble ladies had potions slipped into their goblets by ambitious men with dangerous intentions. Of course, not everyone believed in these things. Some physicians dismissed love potions as superstition. One Parisian doctor even mocked them in a lecture, saying, "If lust could be made by herbs, every cook would be a courtesan," which is a solid burn by medieval standards. But others insisted potions worked, or at least they seemed to, because sometimes belief is enough. You drink something strange, you feel the heat rise, and your brain does the rest. A racing pulse, a fleeting thought, a glance that lingers too long, and suddenly you're convinced you're in love, or that they are. Which raises the biggest question. Was any of it real? Did these brews truly spark love, or just excuse reckless behaviour? Historians still debate whether these potions were more chemical, psychological, or placebo. But either way, they carried weight. You could be accused of witchcraft just for owning the wrong herbs. A woman in 15th century Rouen was hanged for selling heart wine that caused a married knight to abandon his wife. The wife claimed enchantment. The court believed her. Others were luckier. In some towns, love potion sellers operated like legal tradesmen, licensed, taxed, occasionally fined for overpromising. You could buy a quick blood syrup for a silver coin, or a blushing wine for less than a loaf of bread. Whether it worked, another matter. And the true victims? Often the ones who wanted to believe most. Lonely women, discarded wives, lovers parted by war or class. People who'd been told that desire was a sin, that love was salvation, and who would try anything to make the two align. You finish your drink and blink hard. Was that tree always smiling? Probably not. But this is the Middle Ages. You might just be seeing what you want to see. And tomorrow, when you wake with the taste of honey and regret still on your tongue, you'll wonder, did I fall in love, or just fall for the fantasy? You wake up under a tree, your mouth dry, your thoughts foggy. Last night's potion left more questions than answers. But today, you follow the sound of chanting. Dozens of voices rising, rhythmic, desperate. And when you get closer, you realise they're not praying. They're whipping themselves. Welcome to the world of flagellants and pain as pleasure, where salvation hurt, and for some, that was exactly the point. It starts as a religious movement. The year is 1349. The Black Death has wiped out a third of Europe. People are terrified, and the church isn't offering enough answers. So groups take matters into their own hands, literally. Men and women form processions, marching barefoot through cities, striking their backs with whips until the skin splits and blood runs like ink down a confession scroll. The idea? Purify the soul through suffering. Make God notice. Make him forgive. But that's just the surface. Because under all that blood and chanting, something darker stirs. Something addictive. You walk alongside one such group, their tunics removed, their backs raw and marked. They chant in unison, faces locked in trance. And some of them are enjoying it. Not smiling, not laughing, but caught in a kind of rapture that feels far beyond religious ecstasy. And this wasn't just suspicion. Contemporary observers noticed too. One monk in Germany wrote of men who whipped themselves, then lingered in pleasure afterward. A nun described the sensation as a fire under the flesh that both punished and comforted. Historians still argue, were these true believers, or were some just finding new outlets for old cravings? Because medieval life was already full of pain. Childbirth, war, disease, every day was a test. But this pain was chosen. It was structured, controlled, and that, in a world where almost nothing else was, made it strangely powerful. You start to understand why it spread like wildfire. Flagellant groups travelled from town to town, drawing crowds like rock stars of repentance. Sometimes 50, sometimes hundreds. Men, and occasionally women, moved in synchronized loops, swinging their scourges with chilling grace. Blood hit the cobblestones. Children watched. And occasionally, people joined on the spot, overcome by the spectacle. There were rules, of course. You were supposed to beat yourself only so much. Enough to show penance, not enough to die. But self-control wasn't always part of the experience. One chronicler described a man who wept, moaned, and bled until he collapsed, smiling. Make of that what you will. And what about the implements? Whips made of knotted rope, braided cords, sometimes embedded with small metal bits or hooks. Some used chains. Others used thorn branches or, in rare cases, bone fragments. Not the kind of thing you pick up at your local shrine gift shop. Now, here's where it gets intimate. Many flagellants practiced in pairs or small groups. One would whip while the other watched. Then they'd switch. Some did it in private homes, others in dark corners of churches after hours. One woman in Belgium was reported as guiding her husband's lash by hand, helping him aim true. Some couples even integrated flagellation into their marital routine. The connection between pain, devotion, and closeness became tangled. And the church? Oh, it had opinions. At first, the church tolerated the movement. It seemed like genuine piety. But as the groups grew wilder, chanting unauthorized hymns, declaring visions, and occasionally performing naked rituals, Rome got nervous. Popes began banning flagellant sects, calling them heretical, dangerous, and spiritually perverse. Sevens. One papal decree specifically condemned those who strike themselves in lustful imitation of Christ's suffering. That's an extremely specific problem to have. And still, it continued, underground, mostly, hidden in barns, cellars, or forest clearings. Some did it alone. Some hired help. And some joined brotherhoods that kept precise records of lashes. Thrice daily, at dawn, noon, and dusk. 20 strokes per sin. Medieval Fitbit, but for guilt. Fringe tail. A flagellant leader in Prague reportedly claimed that 10 lashes given by a virgin could cleanse all sins, even mortal ones. Naturally, many virgins began offering their services. Some were young. Others were just convincing. One nobleman claimed he was whipped by a saint disguised as a milkmaid. The milkmaid later disappeared with half his estate. Enlightenment indeed. And let's not overlook the gendered edge. For women, flagellation was both spiritual act and acceptable physical expression. In a society where female desire was smothered, this gave some women an outlet. The body could feel intense sensation without anyone accusing them of sin because it was suffering. Right? One nun's diary from the 15th century includes the line, "When the lash strikes, I remember him. When it burns, I am closer to his love." That's layered. There's no clean way to separate devotion from desire there. And maybe that was the point. Of course, not everyone took it to such extremes. Some used symbolic lashes, a few taps during prayer, a belt across the thighs, or even imaginary wounds traced during meditation. Pain became a language. You didn't need to bleed to speak it fluently. Still, the obsession remained. Flagellation shows up in medieval plays, poetry, and illustrations. Some depict martyrs whipping themselves while demons flee. Others are more suggestive, figures bound at the altar, ropes trailing across bare skin. Subtle as a gong. Even after the worst of the movement faded, echoes of it survived. In penitential processions, in monastic punishments, in whispered stories of saints who loved the lash more than the kiss. Sevens. And tonight, as you leave the scene, the last of the flagellants disappear down the road, their blood drying in slow, sticky lines. You can still hear their chanting, faint and fading. Purge the body. free the soul. 7s. But you're left wondering, what if some didn't want to be free? What if the pain was the point? You walk with the chant still echoing in your bones, the whip marks ghosting across your imagination. But now something colder creeps into the night. Not a chill in the air, though there is one, but a shiver that moves deeper, bone deep. You hear whispers through a cracked chapel door. A woman is groaning, writhing, her voice sharp and desperate. People watch. Some pray. Others just stare. And someone says, "She's possessed." 7s. But maybe she's just really horny. Tonight, you step into the anxious gap between ecstasy and evil, when medieval minds couldn't quite tell the difference. Welcome to the slippery world of demonic possession, or just overwhelming desire. In a time when women were meant to be modest, quiet, and spiritually passive, anything that looked like too much energy was suspicious. A woman screaming in church? Possessed. A nun having nightly visions of Christ's warm embrace. Probably holy. Unless, of course, she was enjoying it too much, then back to possessed. And that's where things get murky. The church believed demons could enter your body through sin, through sorcery, or through simple vulnerability. And one of the most open parts of the body, according to male theologians, the womb. Because obviously, medieval medicine believed in wandering womb theory, the idea that a woman's uterus could literally move around her body, causing hysteria, choking, even seizures. So when a woman shook violently or moaned in ecstasy, it wasn't a panic attack or orgasm. No, it was her womb. Acting up. Or, worse, letting a demon in through feminine weakness. 7s. Historians still argue whether most of these cases were misdiagnosed illness, suppressed trauma, or social rebellion, but the end result was often the same. She was restrained. Take the case of Sister Agnes of Eisleben, 14th century. She was devout, obedient. Then one night, she began sighing and heaving, her voice rising in pitch like a songbird. The convent believed it was divine rapture, until she began describing the arms of an angel wrapped around her thighs. Suddenly, it wasn't holy anymore. They called in a priest. During the exorcism, Agnes screamed, cried out names no one recognised, and clawed her robes open. The records say she spoke in tongues, but one sceptical scribe simply wrote, "She desired much." That was his entire note. There's another account from Paris where a merchant's daughter fell to the ground, rolling in rhythm, shrieking of unseen flames. The priest assumed demonic attack. He read verses over her. But her father, panicking, brought in a doctor instead. The doctor prescribed sleep, wine, and herbs that soothe feminine longing. A few days later, she was fine. Or at least, quiet. Some women were less lucky. If a possessed woman was too defiant or too overtly sensual, she could be imprisoned or burned. One infamous case in Italy involved a widow who claimed the devil licked her feet at night. The church tried to beat the demon out of her. She died within a week. But not all stories ended in tragedy. Some nuns learned to weaponize their visions. St. Catherine of Siena wrote about a mystical marriage with Christ so intense it left her body trembling for hours. Another mystic claimed she felt the Holy Spirit pass through her lower belly like lightning. These descriptions walk a fine line, one foot in heaven, the other brushing something far more carnal. Some even played possessed. A Spanish servant girl faked fits to avoid work, then got caught moaning the name of a local butcher mid-exorcism. The priest reportedly paused and said, "This demon seems very well informed." Still, the symptoms were hard to categorize. Women collapsed, cried, foamed at the mouth. Sometimes they stripped off clothes. One German town believed a baker's wife was possessed because she twitched her hips in her sleep and cried out with pleasure. Medieval diagnosis. Demon. Modern diagnosis. night terrors, or a dream that got really good. Fringe theory. A few early physicians believed some of these women were reacting to celibacy, not religious, but imposed. In strict households or convents, sexual repression might explode into convulsions, hallucinations, or bizarre behaviour. The body burns what the mind cannot say, wrote one anonymous monk. And men weren't immune, either. One priest in Flanders was said to be ridden by a female demon who visited him nightly. He described being paralysed by heat and awaking spent and sore. Church leaders declared it a succubus attack, but some whispered that the priest had simply had a dream, a very honest one. Succubi were the go-to explanation for nocturnal emissions, by the way. If you woke up damp and guilty, you didn't need to admit desire, you just blamed the night demon with big eyes and bigger intentions. Convenient. And sometimes exorcisms themselves turned erotic. No joke. There are records of priests laying hands on writhing women, chanting prayers while pressing oil into skin. One particularly unnerving manual insists that the priest should avoid direct eye contact if the possessed stares with longing. That detail speaks volumes. Some women were clever about it. A nun in Bohemia reportedly faked possession to get more personal time with her confessor. She'd twitch and groan until he arrived. Then she'd whisper, only he could banish the devil. That went on for 8 months. Historians don't know what became of her, but you've got to respect the dedication. Was it possession? Performance? Undiagnosed illness? Unfulfilled hunger? Maybe all of the above. But one thing is clear. The line between sin and sickness, between pleasure and punishment, was thinner than parchment. And you, standing outside that chapel now, wonder how many of those cries were for help, and how many were just for release. In a world that didn't give women many ways to express desire, maybe calling it a demon was the only way to say it aloud. The wind shifts. A groan echoes inside. You step back, because maybe she's possessed, or maybe she's just tired of pretending not to want. You walk faster now. Something about those groans still echoing from the chapel has you rethinking your entire evening. But there's a flicker up ahead, torchlight. You follow it down into a narrow alley, where the stones glisten with soot and secrets. A door creaks open. A man in a heavy cloak beckons you inside, whispers one word: transmutation. Sevenths. You've just stumbled into the workshop of a medieval alchemist, not to find gold, but to learn the erotic secrets of orgasmic transformation. Yes, really. In the late Middle Ages, alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was also about transformation of the self, spiritually, emotionally, and sometimes sexually. You're in a world where bodily fluids are ingredients, orgasms might open cosmic portals, and the Philosopher's Stone could be code for something far more intimate. Let's unpack that. Carefully. Alchemists believed that the human body mirrored the universe. The elements, earth, air, fire, water, existed not just outside us but inside. Balance them right, and you could heal. Align them, and you might achieve transcendence. And so, some fringe alchemists theorized that sexual climax was a moment of total alignment, when the body, mind, and spirit all ignited at once. Not just pleasure, transformation, an explosion of life energy that could, in theory, alter reality. One 15th century text from Prague refers to the fire of the fifth gate, described as a moment when the seed of man and the joy of woman converge in perfect celestial heat. Whether that's poetry or chemistry, historians still argue. Others got way more literal. In a manuscript from Cologne, the alchemist known only as Brother Linhart describes a ritual involving prolonged abstinence, fasting, and finally, on the 7th day, a holy union with one's companion, timed with the rise of Mars and the setting of Venus. At climax, both were to cry aloud the name of the unifying angel. Supposedly, this unlocked the ability to create a tincture that cured infertility, depression, and Oddly, dandruff. Science? No. But they believed. And belief makes strange things happen. You glance around the dim workshop. Herbs hang from the ceiling. Wax drips from copper bowls. A scroll on the wall shows two figures entwined, surrounded by symbols. Mercury, sulphur, salt, and something that looks suspiciously like an erection wrapped in ivy. Fringe fact: some alchemists believed that semen, especially when elevated by spiritual union, was a kind of living gold. A vital essence that, if captured and stored properly, could be used in healing potions. One Italian text recommends collecting it on clean linen, drying it, and grinding it with rose petals. The author insists this powder, when mixed with honey, could reawaken the soul. Whether anyone tested this method remains unclear, probably for the best. Of course, most mainstream alchemists rolled their eyes. They called these theories erotic corruption and distanced themselves from such nonsense. But underground, the books passed hand to hand, hidden in cupboards, wrapped in cloth, whispered about in bathhouses and back rooms, and some believed the union didn't even need a second person. Solitary rituals, essentially spiritualized masturbation, were described in hushed tones. One mystic wrote of reaching the divine peak alone, with breath and intention as partners. He claimed that, when done correctly, his vision blurred and he saw his own body as pure light. That might have been revelation, or dehydration, or both. There's also evidence of group experiments. Not orgies, at least. Not in the usual sense. More like energetic circles. Participants would lie on the ground, breathing in sync, sometimes stimulating themselves while chanting specific alchemical formulas. Supposedly, if enough people climaxed simultaneously, the air would shimmer and time would bend. Again, no peer-reviewed data, just a few woodcut illustrations that are, frankly, unsettling. And the women? Oh, they were part of this too. Some female alchemists, rare but real, wrote about sexual energy as power. One, known as Elise of Bruges, recorded her experiments in a book called The Furnace of the Rose. She described the female orgasm as the unlocking of the hidden gate, where heat and wetness melt into the river of the stars, which sounds like a perfume ad but was meant very seriously. She claimed that during climax, she could see solutions to difficult alchemical problems. She also brewed a love tonic using her own sweat. The recipe ends with, "Whisper your name into the bottle, then wait." Sevens. Did any of this work? Define work. Sevens. If the goal was enlightenment, empowerment, or just an excuse to feel something in a repressed, plague-haunted world, then yes. These rituals gave people control, or at least the illusion of it. And here's where it gets weirder. Some alchemists believed orgasmic energy could summon entities, not demons, not angels, but something in between. Energy forms. Spirits. Echoes of past lovers. A London text from 1498 claims a man invoked the ghost of his deceased wife during climax and asked her for alchemical guidance. She whispered secrets in his ear, after which he reportedly discovered a new dye pigment. Haunting or hallucination? You decide. Of course, this entire world was considered heretical. If the church caught wind of your experiments, your workshop could be destroyed. You could be imprisoned, or worse. So these practitioners kept quiet, or encoded their notes in layered metaphors. Instead of saying sex, they wrote fusion. Instead of orgasm, they said transmutation. And everyone pretended not to notice. But sometimes, someone slipped. A letter from a monk in Florence warns his friend to stop combining sacraments with sighs, saying, "You tread the line between the sacred and the unspeakable." That line, it turns out, was walked more often than anyone admitted. And as you leave the alchemist's workshop, Your head spinning with honeyed air and strange equations, you realise something. Sevens, they weren't chasing gold. They were chasing power. And in a world where the church claimed your soul and the crown claimed your body, sometimes the only power left was what you could conjure from your own skin. You leave the alchemist's den behind, stepping out into night air that's suddenly too still, too perfect, like the world's holding its breath. You hear the distant clatter of armour, a faint neigh of horses, and the low hum of singing. You're near a battlefield camp now. Rows of tents stretch across the hills like folded parchment under stars. But you're not here for blood and glory. You're here for what happens after the swordplay. Welcome to the odd-key secretive world of nightly kinks and tent etiquette, where chivalry gets very weird, very fast. You approach a tent trimmed with embroidered lions. A torch flickers outside, but inside there's laughter, soft, hushed, intimate. You peek through the flap and spot a knight, still wearing his chainmail shirt but nothing else beneath it, sitting cross-legged while a squire gently combs his hair and reads aloud from a book of virtues. This isn't your Hollywood war fantasy. This is the emotional weirdness of medieval masculinity laid bare. You see, while knights were famous for charging into battle and swearing loyalty to noble ladies, their actual love lives. Messy, complicated, and often deeply coded in ritual, costume, and some fairly bizarre bedroom rules. Let's start with the idea of the chaste knight. The perfect warrior monk who channels all his passion into faith, loyalty, and swordsmanship. Except he's 22, full of adrenaline, and sharing a tent with another knight named Etienne who keeps polishing his helmet with suspicious intensity. In knightly circles, emotional intimacy with other men wasn't uncommon. In fact, it was encouraged. Brotherhood in arms wasn't just a slogan, it was a lifestyle. Some knightly orders even required pledges of loyalty that sounded, frankly, like marriage vows. In one French order, 2 knights swore to love and protect one another above all others, even unto death. Some historians argue these were just expressions of brotherhood. Others? Not so sure. In tent life? It had rules. A knight's tent was his domain, his chapel, his man cave, and, occasionally, his bedroom. It had to be kept tidy, because guests might arrive unannounced. Etiquette manuals from the 13th century include specific tips like: remove your boots before reclining, let no wine stain your furs, speak not of battle while in the bedchamber. Sevens. Yes, there were bedchamber rules. Some tents were furnished lavishly, thick tapestries, feather mattresses, scented water basins. Others doubled as love dens. A German knight named Ulrich von Liechtenstein, yes, that one, in his self-aggrandizing autobiography, wrote of seducing noblewomen between jousts, using poetry and the scent of rose oil on clean sheets. Whether he exaggerated is debated, but the vibe checks out. Then there's chastity cosplay. You read that right. In certain knightly orders, especially religious military hybrids like the Templars and the Teutonic Knights, sexual abstinence was a badge of honour. So naturally, some knights took it further. They'd wear chastity chains beneath their armour, or have squires guard their purity by sleeping beside them like human alarm systems. The irony? These same men often confessed to impure dreams. One squire wrote that his master cried out in sleep the name of the Virgin. And also, strangely, the name Gerard. Sevens. Moving on. Tent etiquette also extended to romantic liaisons. You couldn't just bring someone back. It had to be discreet. And clean. A common punishment for improper conduct in the tent was public humiliation, usually being made to ride backwards through camp holding your stained bedding. Yikes. But there were exceptions. In sieges or long campaigns, some commanders allowed controlled sexual encounters, either with local women or, more commonly, sex workers travelling with the army. Entire sub-economies sprang up around battlefields. Mobile brothels, perfumed bath tents, love letter couriers. One knight wrote home requesting fresh gloves and my favourite girl, if the roads are safe. Chivalry, but make it logistical. Fringe fact. A 14th century campaign ledger includes a mysterious expense. 10 silver for the lady in blue, 2 for her cart, 1 for discretion. Historians are still trying to figure out who the lady in blue was, but most assume she wasn't a tailor. Also, role play. Oh yes. Certain knights participated in elaborate romantic rituals where they'd reenact tales of courtly love. A lady would pretend to be captured. The knight would rescue her, sometimes in costume, sometimes with props, often with wine. One English baron's tent inventory included a costume labelled the Black Serpent of Temptation and a gold-trimmed blindfold. Make of that what you will. And while many of these dalliances were heterosexual, not all were. Letters survive between knights that blur the line between brotherhood and something far more tender. Your absence strikes me like a wound, one writes. I sleep on your cloak when the fire burns low. Another scrawls, I dreamed of your hand in mine, and I awoke to find my fingers curled around nothing. Poetic. Sure. Platonic? Maybe. But the subtext is practically yelling. The church, predictably, turned a blind eye unless things got too public. Knights were needed. Their sins were often quietly confessed, then quickly forgiven. After all, how do you scold the guy who just beheaded 10 enemies in the name of Christ? And yet, even the pious had their moments. A knight returning from crusade confessed to having fleshly thoughts while polishing his blade. He didn't clarify what blade meant. The priest gave him 7 Our Fathers and a sharp look. So here you are, standing at the edge of a knight's tent, watching shadows move behind the canvas, slow, careful, intimate. You hear a soft laugh, a whispered name. Maybe it's a lover. Maybe it's just a brother in arms. Either way, there's more to chivalry than dragons and dragon slaying. Sometimes there are blindfolds, and scented oil, and a full set of rules about how not to spill wine on your wolfskin rug. You leave the camp behind, slipping through fields that stretch wide and silent under a sky full of stars. Everything feels calmer now, until you pass a barn. You hear giggles, then whispers, then something that sounds like a bleat. You pause. You listen closer. You shouldn't, because tonight you've arrived at one of the darkest, strangest corners of medieval rumour. Beastly rumours and barnyard accusations, a world where sex, shame, and scapegoating spiral into something grotesque. Let's set the scene. It's 14th century Germany. A goat goes missing. A child finds it 2 days later, trembling in a ditch. It's unharmed, but rumours begin. The animal was seen near a bachelor's cottage. That bachelor has no wife. He's too quiet. He once made a joke about lonely winters. The whispers grow legs. He's accused of bestiality. It sounds like the kind of rural paranoia that should die out quickly. But it doesn't. Because in the medieval world, bestiality wasn't just a gross rumour, it was a capital crime. And in many places, it wasn't the human who bore all the punishment. Sometimes the animal was put on trial too. You heard that right. Legal records from France, Switzerland, and the Low Countries detail dozens of cases where animals were tried, yes, in a court, for participating in unnatural acts. Pigs, donkeys, goats, even cows. One case in Savoy involved a rooster accused of laying an egg, also considered sorcery. The verdict? Guilty. Execution ordered. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic, religious, or just weird public theatre. But they were real. A 15th century case from Flanders records a man and a cow tried together for carnal relations. The cow was led into court. Witnesses testified. The cow refused to look at the man, which was apparently damning. Both were sentenced to death. It wasn't always about truth. More often, it was about power. Let's say you're a peasant with a grudge against your neighbour. He's richer. Or maybe he just built a new shed and didn't invite you to his harvest party. You spread a rumour. You say you saw him being too friendly with his sheep. Boom. Trial. Social ruin. Possibly worse. Accusations like this were weapons, often aimed at the powerless, the odd, the isolated. Bachelors, widows, foreigners, anyone who didn't fit the local mould. Fringe detail? In parts of rural Spain, it was believed that a man who had intercourse with a donkey would become permanently infertile, and the donkey, if still alive, would be marked with the taint of lust and sold at market at a discount. A literal clearance rack for cursed livestock. And these fears weren't always groundless in the eyes of the law. Canon law and civil law alike listed bestiality as a mortal sin, often lumped together with sodomy and witchcraft. The punishments? Death, dismemberment, or public shaming. In one horrific account from 15th century Saxony, a man was forced to wear a wooden cow's head while being marched through town before execution. The crowd jeered. Children threw stones. The psychology behind this gets dark. The medieval mind saw the human body as constantly vulnerable to temptation, to possession, to corruption. And animals, so nearby, so physical, so untamed, became symbols of both purity and danger. One minute they're God's creatures, the next, the devil's accomplices. And if you were accused, good luck disproving it. Most trials relied on character witnesses and vague testimony. One account reads, "He was seen petting the goat for too long." That was enough. In some cases, animals confessed. A donkey was reported to have brayed when the accused's name was said aloud, seen as divine confirmation. Another tale involves a pig that refused to eat after its owner was arrested, suggesting a mutual shame, or just stress. But nobody asked the pig. Women weren't immune to these accusations, either, especially healers or those who lived alone. In Hungary, a midwife was accused not only of sleeping with her dog but of teaching others to do the same through witchcraft. The evidence? She owned no mirrors, and someone claimed her cat spoke Latin. She was executed. And let's not ignore the sexual symbolism that ran through medieval bestiaries, the animal encyclopedias of the time. Some were beautiful allegories. Others, not so subtle. The donkey was stubborn and lustful. The goat was wicked and lecherous. The snake, sensual and female. These weren't just natural observations. They were warnings. And when a person was accused of bestiality, it wasn't just a crime, it was proof, in the community's eyes, that they had become less than human. One French bishop declared in 1322, "A man who lays with beast is no longer man. He is dust awaiting fire." Charming. There's also the political angle. A noble might accuse a rival of beastly acts not because he believed it, but because it stuck. The stain of unnatural desire couldn't be scrubbed. It made people back away, even if you were cleared. Socially, you were radioactive. And then there's the terrifying possibility, what if some of these stories were confessions? Not to crimes, but to feelings. Twisted, confused, shame-filled, misdirected desire. You live in a world where sex is feared, bodies are punished, and no one talks about consent. You feel something you don't understand. You talk to a priest. He fills in the blanks. Before you know it, you're on trial for something you never did, but now believe you could have. That's the danger of shame. It becomes a story you start telling yourself. As you step away from the barn, you catch a flicker of movement. Just a sheep, sleepy-eyed, chewing something dry and tasteless. Totally innocent. But you swear it looks at you sideways. You walk faster. Because in the Middle Ages, even a glance from a goat could land you at the centre of a nightmare, and all it took was one whisper. You flee the barn and keep walking. The stars blur above you now, maybe from exhaustion, maybe from what you've just heard. You think the worst is behind you. It isn't. You hear drums, not festive ones. Hollow, slow. You turn a corner and see torches circling a raised platform. A woman stands at its centre, hands bound, hair loose around her face like a halo set on fire. Her eyes meet yours for a second too long. She's not weeping. You've arrived at a witch trial. But this isn't just torture and fire. No, this one's focused on something more specific. Tonight, you learn what happened when witch hunts became erotic confessions, and how people, especially women, were forced to admit to sins no one committed, but everyone feared. In 15th and 16th century Europe, the obsession with witches wasn't just about hexes, storms, or blighted crops. It was also, disturbingly often, about sex, especially the kind the church didn't want to imagine but couldn't stop asking about. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, laid it out plainly. Women were more likely to be witches because they were weaker in faith and insatiable in carnal lust. That's not a paraphrase. That's chapter 1. According to this logic, women didn't just sign pacts with the devil, they slept with him. Over and over. And the inquisitors wanted details. Trials often began with vague accusations, strange herbs in the garden, an illness that spread too fast, an animal acting weird. But under torture, the interrogators steered the conversation quickly. The questions weren't, did you curse the crops? They were, did you lie with Satan? Did he pleasure you? What form did he take? Did you feel joy? Sevens. Yes. They asked that. One woman in Cologne, beaten for hours, finally confessed that the devil came to her as a black dog. When asked what he did, she said, he licked, then burned. The court record notes that she seemed uncertain if the act brought pleasure, as if that was the real point. Another in Switzerland claimed Satan visited her in dreams, pressing upon me with heavy thighs. The inquisitor demanded she reenact the moment in front of a cross, to prove it was real. When she refused, they took her clothes. Historians still debate how many of these erotic confessions were hallucinations, trauma responses, or just exhausted attempts to say something that would make the pain stop. But they were disturbingly consistent. Satan, in these stories, was often described as exceptionally skilled, which is odd. He was said to have a cold phallus, rough skin, and an unholy scent, but also the ability to satisfy in ways mortal men could not. Was this projection? Repression? A glimpse into lives so controlled, so monitored, that the only place women could fantasize was through forced confession. Fringe fact. Some women, when not under torture, did describe dreams of otherworldly pleasure, sometimes with a demon, sometimes with saints. A nun in Venice claimed nightly visits from St. Michael, who held her with light and heat and made her weep with joy. Her abbess called it a vision. Her priest called it something else. And then there were the Sabbaths. No, not the restful kind. In witch trial law, the witch's Sabbath was a moonlit gathering of women who flew to distant hills, danced naked, and had wild orgies with beasts, demons, and each other. These scenes were obsessively detailed in trial records. They kissed Satan's anus. They laid in circles, face to face. They sang with their mouths full of sin. Sevens. Spoiler. These events almost certainly didn't happen, but inquisitors described them as if they had attended. It wasn't just punishment, it was voyeurism disguised as justice. And men weren't safe, either. In a 1490 trial in southern France, a male healer was accused of summoning succubi, female spirits who aroused men in their sleep. Under torture, he admitted to being mounted in dreams and awaking in fluid fear. He was hanged 3 days later. Why was this so common? Because the church had two competing fears: spiritual heresy and uncontrolled desire. Witch trials allowed them to attack both at once. A woman's body was sinful. Her pleasure, if unapproved, was dangerous. If she didn't want a man, she must be enchanted. If she wanted too much, she must be in league with hell. And so, the interrogations focused on penetration, not power. On touch, not theology. Did he enter you? Did you bleed? Did you cry out? These weren't just legal questions. They were a kind of ritual humiliation, a way to rip autonomy out of the victim through her own words. Sometimes, people resisted. One accused girl in Bavaria refused to speak, even under brutal torture. Instead, she sang a lullaby her mother taught her. The record says she died with her tongue swollen, teeth broken, but still singing. Her name wasn't recorded, but most people broke. They confessed to things that made no sense. That Satan had a serpent's tongue, that he gave them a powder that made them irresistible, that they grew devil teats and fed imps with their thighs. And after they said all this, they were burned, publicly, because the spectacle wasn't just about justice. It was about fear and control, and letting the crowd watch a woman be stripped of dignity before she was stripped of life. The erotic content of witch trials wasn't a side effect. It was central. These weren't just legal hearings. They were twisted performances where sex, power, shame, and punishment all merged into one terrifying show. And tonight, as the crowd watches the woman on the platform, you wonder what she's confessed to, what they made her say, whether she chose her own words or if they were shoved into her mouth like ashes. She meets your gaze one last time, and you think, she never had a chance to tell her story, only theirs. Smoke clings to your clothes as you leave the square. The fire's gone out, but its stink lingers, char, sweat, scorched cloth. You walk faster, trying to forget her eyes, her silence, her song. But there's no escaping the next part. Not when your own body's suddenly itching. Burning. Fading. Welcome to the realm of cursed genitals and magic remedies, where the medieval fear of lust turned into nightmares of shrinking, swelling, and disappearing anatomy. Yes, disappearing. Let's get straight to it. People in the Middle Ages believed that your genitals could be stolen. Magically. Cursed. Withered. Or made to swell like an angry fruit if you crossed the wrong woman. Or, worse, if you sinned in the wrong mood. You're not hallucinating. You're just in 14th century France. A man bursts into a priest's quarters, sobbing. His voice cracks. He swears that a woman he rejected cursed him. And remember, he moans, is gone. It is not there. I see nothing but flesh. The priest tries to reason with him. The man insists. The town gathers. Some say it's proof of witchcraft. Others whisper it's punishment for what he did to the baker's wife last spring. And believe it or not, this was common. The phenomenon is known today as genital retraction syndrome, a psychological condition that still exists in rare cases. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't treated with therapy. It was treated with holy water and screaming. People genuinely believed that witches could make penises vanish, not by cutting them off, but by stealing them spiritually, sometimes keeping them in jars, boxes, or even birds' nests. Fringe detail. One inquisitor's manual describes a woman who allegedly kept 29 penises in a wooden chest, feeding them oats and honey. When asked why they writhed, she claimed they were hungry for home. Whether this tale was metaphor or madness, no one quite agrees. But these stories weren't just about men. Women had their share of panic too. In parts of Eastern Europe, tales circulated of cursed swelling, where a woman's body would become unbearably inflamed after sleeping with the wrong man, especially if he was suspected of sorcery or foreign blood. The cure? Either prayer, or squatting over burning herbs while a midwife chanted protection spells. What caused these symptoms? Likely STIs, allergic reactions, poor hygiene, or psychological stress. But in the medieval mind, They were signs of moral failure. Your body betrayed you because you had betrayed God. And there were treatments. Oh yes. One Parisian apothecary sold a cream made from crushed pearl, rose oil, and wine-soaked earth to restore the manhood when taken by witches. Another recommended applying a poultice of boiled onions and horse dung. The stink draws out the sin, claimed the recipe. More likely it just repelled company. For women, cures were even stranger. A Tuscan manuscript recommends inserting a clove of garlic between the folds for 3 nights, followed by a blessing. Another calls for milk from a one-eyed goat, sprinkled on the abdomen at dawn, while reciting Psalm 51 backward. If your eyes are watering, you're not alone. The line between medicine and magic was always fuzzy. Many believed that diseases of the genitals were the work of demons, not just figuratively, but literally. Lust opened a door, and the demons crawled in. One bishop warned that the devil lurks in the humours of the belly, and from there he poisons the root of man. Sevens, in other words. Horny equals haunted. Some remedies involved binding spells, knots tied in cords or locks of hair, hidden under mattresses or buried in gardens. These were believed to prevent cheating, or in worse cases, prevent functioning entirely. Men who couldn't perform were sometimes said to be tied, and would seek out a wise woman to untie them in every possible sense. And if you think this sounds like folk superstition, not formal religion, think again. Confession manuals included questions like, have you laid with a woman and felt yourself vanish in her? Or did your parts behave as if touched by shadow? One even warns that dreaming of fire near the groin was a sign of spiritual infestation. And yes, people confess to it. There's even a case from 15th century Venice where a married couple sought an annulment on the grounds that the husband's penis came and went like a spirit. The court laughed until a priest testified he, too, had once been afflicted. Suddenly it was not funny. The annulment was granted. Sometimes the cures were violent. Hot irons, cauterization, bloodletting of the groin. A Saxon manual suggests leeches on the thighs to draw down the fever of lust. One can only imagine the results. But not all the stories are grim. There's a record from Norway of a man who, believing his penis was stolen, travelled to 5 different shrines, each time offering a small wooden carving of what he lost. On the 6th trip, he claimed it returned with joy. The locals built a chapel in honour of the miracle. True, doubtful, but faith, especially when paired with fear, is a powerful thing. These stories, bizarre as they are, tell you something very real about medieval life. Sevens. People lived in fear of losing control of their bodies, their urges, their reputations. And when something went wrong below the belt, it wasn't just embarrassing. It was existential. Your desire could mark you. Your lust could curse you. And if your parts vanished or failed or swelled beyond recognition, the world didn't say, see a doctor. Sevens. It said, you're cursed. Tonight, you lie down unsure whether that tingle in your thigh is a bug bite or divine retribution. You whisper a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for anatomical stability. Because in this world, keeping your soul safe was one thing. Keeping your parts where they belonged, that was something else entirely. You wake up the next morning instinctively checking yourself under the blanket. Still there, intact. Congratulations, you've survived the night uncursed. But now the sun's high, and the streets are alive with noise. Bells ringing, children shouting, women laughing from open windows, and down a narrow alley, a red-painted door swings open with the sound of coins clinking inside. Welcome to the business end of the story. The strange economics of sex work, where sin had a price tag, and brothels operated with bureaucratic flair. In the medieval world, sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was organised. Not always, not everywhere, but in many towns and cities, especially in bustling trade hubs like London, Bruges, or Florence. Prostitution was treated as a necessary evil. Better to have it regulated, the logic went, than let lust run wild. So brothels were licensed, zoned, taxed, sometimes even advertised. You pass a brothel in Toulouse, 14th century. It's clean, draped in red fabric. There's a sign above the door with a carved lion and a lute. No explicit words, just suggestive symbols. You step inside. There's a waiting area with fresh straw, bowls of perfume water, a sleepy cat, and a price list pinned on the wall. One of the women waves lazily from the corner. She's smoking a pipe and counting coins. Not shy, not ashamed. She's working. Here's the twist. Many of these brothels were run by women, often former sex workers themselves, now called abbesses of the house. They handled security, collected payments, and negotiated with city officials to stay open. Some even paid rent directly to the church. Yes, the church. In some places, the church owned the buildings brothels operated from. It was called moral containment. Better to herd lust into one street than let it seep into every alley. One Florentine priest famously said, "It is better for men to spill seed in sin than blood in battle." Technically unbiblical, but definitely efficient. Taxes on brothels helped fund hospitals, public works, and in one bizarre case, a bell tower. There's a record from Lübeck where city officials funded renovations to a cathedral roof using levies from the Street of Warm Beds. Divine synergy, you could say. Fringe fact. In Avignon, the Pope's city, the brothels were placed just outside the wall, but within eyesight of the palace. Symbolism? Maybe. Or maybe just convenience. Now, let's talk fees. Rates varied by status, age, beauty, and what you were willing to do. A typical encounter cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a labourer. More if the client wanted songs, role play, or time in a heated room. Some women specialised in music, massage, or storytelling. Others just offered conversation, because lonely men will pay to be looked at like they matter. That hasn't changed. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some brothels were religiously themed. In Bohemia, one house of ill repute had rooms decorated like confessionals. You'd enter, say your sins, and the woman would absolve you through, well, you can guess. Another establishment in Bruges was called the Chapel, and its workers dressed in faux nun habits. The church hated it. The customers loved it. And not all sex workers were poor or desperate. Some, especially those who served nobility, became quite wealthy. They owned jewellery, land, even servants. One Prussian courtesan named Isabeau was known for her emerald ring, which she claimed was blessed by 3 bishops, none of whom knew each other. Clever. These elite women were sometimes called courtesans or public women, and they played a game of survival with remarkable skill. Some even ran their own schools, teaching younger girls etiquette, music, reading, and seduction. One such academy in Venice was disguised as a lace shop. The lace? Exquisite. The gossip? Priceless. Of course, not all experiences were elegant. Many women were exploited, unpaid, or treated brutally, especially in unregulated zones or during times of war. Soldiers often paid in stolen goods, promises, or nothing at all. Some towns set up free brothels near barracks to keep soldiers calm. You don't want to think about what happened behind those doors. And children? Yes, tragically, child prostitution existed too, though laws against it were passed in several cities by the 14th century. One Florentine decree banned the hiring of girls under 12 for immoral acts. A step forward, yes, but also a glimpse into how dark things had already gotten. There's a case from London where a brothel was raided, and the madam claimed all her workers were of age. But court records show at least 2 were 11. The punishment? A fine. That's it. Because the real concern wasn't the girl's safety. It was that the city hadn't gotten its cut, And how did people know where the brothels were? Simple. The red light. Yep. The term goes back farther than you think. Medieval brothels hung red lanterns outside, symbolising warmth, lust, and visibility. It also made them easy to find during citywide raids. Some brothels even had musical cues, bells or drums, to let passers-by know business was open. But there was shame, too. Workers weren't allowed to wear certain colours, often banned from wearing green or gold. Some cities required prostitutes to wear striped veils or exposed shoulders. Others marked their doors with chalk symbols each week to signal the household's legal status. A legal sex worker could be protected. An illegal one? Fair game for punishment, harassment, or worse. Yet, despite the stigma, sex workers became central to the social fabric of the medieval city. They knew secrets. They passed messages. They witnessed crimes and sometimes committed them. In one case, a courtesan saved her city by seducing and drugging an invading captain, allowing locals to storm his quarters. She was honoured with free rent for life. In another, the brothel kept a ledger, not just for finances, but for reviews. One entry reads, March through. Henri. Polite. Sweaty. Paid twice. Sevens. So tonight, as the red lights glow along the street, and you walk past perfumed windows and cracked shutters, you realise something. This was more than sin. It was commerce. It was survival. It was a system that thrived in the cracks between morality and money, and left behind stories more honest than the sermons ever were. You walk slowly now, the city winding down with you. Bells toll the hour. The streets empty. Candles flicker behind shuttered windows. And then, from the far end of the cobblestone lane, comes the beat of something different. Slow, deliberate footsteps, followed by the creak of old hinges. A door opens. You've reached the palace. But don't expect privacy. Because tonight, you enter the royal chamber, where love is strategic, bedrooms are crowded, and royal consummation is a public spectacle. Imagine this. You're a young noble, married that morning in a grand ceremony. You're ushered into the royal bedchamber by half the court, priests, noblemen, ladies-in-waiting, and a few eager scribes. They're not leaving. They're here to watch. Not the whole act, usually, but enough to be sure. In royal Europe, consummation wasn't optional. It was political verification. Proof that the marriage wasn't just a fancy parade. It was real, physical, binding. If the union wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. And if heirs were needed, you'd better get started. So they watched. Sometimes they even helped. Let's go to France, 1491. The marriage of Charles VIII to Anne of Brittany. After the banquet, they're walked to bed by a procession of bishops, courtiers, and ladies. The priest blesses the bed. Wine is served. Jokes are made. Anne is undressed by her attendants. Charles by his. They lie down. Curtains are drawn. The room goes quiet, but the guards don't leave. They wait outside, listening. The next morning, a blood-stained sheet is displayed. Sometimes it was real. Sometimes not. There were whispered tricks, vials of chicken blood, red wine stains, even pricked fingertips. Because if that proof wasn't there, everything was at risk. Dowries, treaties, entire wars. Historians still argue how often the full act was actually observed. Some say it was mostly symbolic. Others cite letters, journals, even paintings that suggest otherwise. A Venetian ambassador once wrote, "The king performed his duty before witnesses, with no hesitation, though little grace." Yikes. And it wasn't just France. In England, Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York included a full public procession to the bed, followed by a solemn bedding. Witnesses swore the couple was tucked in, kissed, and left to know one another in Christ's eyes. Whether Christ would approve of the velvet ropes and gossiping nobility is unclear. In Germany, certain noble houses had a consummation bench, yes, a specific piece of furniture designed for the moment. In some versions, the bride would sit while the groom proved his health by lifting her. Don't ask how that translated into long-term marital success. Fringe detail: a 15th century Polish wedding contract included a clause requiring the groom to perform within 1 hour of supper, and again before the morning bell, in the presence of 2 reliable men of faith. No pressure, right? It gets weirder. Sometimes consummation turned into a legal hearing. If the bride later claimed the marriage wasn't consummated, say, to escape an unhappy union, witnesses might be called. Servants would testify about the sounds. Doctors would inspect the couple. The bed could become a courtroom. And what about same-sex accusations? In Spain, one royal annulment case involved a woman claiming her husband preferred the company of a male cousin. Her argument: "I remained as I entered, untouched as a consecrated candle." The cousin was exiled. The husband remarried. No one questioned the candle metaphor. There were even consummation trials, especially when money or land was involved. One German duke had to demonstrate his ability before a panel of clergy and physicians to confirm he could inherit. They gave him wine, privacy, and a local peasant girl. He passed. Barely. And if the king couldn't perform? Panic. A childless monarch meant succession chaos. That's why queens were often watched for signs of pregnancy like royal science projects. Midwives examined their urine, their weight, even their dreams. "She dreamed of fish," one midwife noted. "This is surely a son." Sudden's. Spoiler. It was indigestion. Still, pregnancy wasn't enough. There had to be ongoing performance. Kings were expected to visit their queens frequently and dutifully. Neglect could be considered political sabotage. One noblewoman wrote to her husband, "Do not fail in your conjugal obligations. The realm watches us both." Romantic. And when monarchs did perform well, it became legend. A Hungarian king was nicknamed the Stallion of the Danube, after fathering 8 children in 12 years. His official portrait: subtle bulge. No one commented, but everyone knew. Not all royal unions were tragic, of course. Some couples fell into real affection. There are love letters from Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn filled with longing, flirtation, and mild innuendo. "My heart is knotted with yours, and my codpiece is ever yours to command." Shakespeare he was not, but the man was trying. Yet even in love, the bed was never private. Spies listened. Chambermaids gossiped. Clergy hovered. The royal body wasn't yours. It belonged to the state. Which leads us to the final, absurd detail. Some royal weddings included symbolic bedding before the ceremony. The couple would lie together, fully clothed, watched by guests, just to suggest compatibility. If one giggled, it was a good sign. If one cried, everyone pretended not to notice. And so tonight, as you stand outside a palace chamber door, you imagine the velvet sheets, the flickering candles, the chorus of rustling satin, and beyond it all, 2 people trying to find intimacy with a kingdom breathing down their necks. Because in the medieval world, love was never just between 2. There was always an audience. The fire's out now. The streets have gone still. And you, wandering back through the echo of every strange, tangled, unbelievable thing you've heard tonight, start to feel something else settle in. Not shock. Not judgment. Just quiet understanding. Because for all the rules, the rituals, the whispered sins and shouted accusations, this wasn't really a story about sex. It was about control. Bodies being watched. Choices taken away. Desires contorted into confessions, performances, punishments. It was about people trying to find freedom inside systems that didn't have space for them. And somehow, even under the weight of dogma, plague, fire, and shame, they still looked for ways to connect, to laugh, to love, even if it was messy, strange, or a little bit dangerous. You hear the distant sound of a bell. Somewhere, a window opens, then closes. The night exhales, and so do you. Let it fade now. Let the torches go out and the gossip soften into static. Let the monks return to their silent prayers. Let the royal bedsheets rest undisturbed. No more trials, no more potions, no more secrets. Just breath. Just warmth. And a story you somehow survived with your sense of humour intact. Sleep well, stranger. You earned it. End of script. Sweet dreams.